Darwin, a professora Frances Siebert. Eu vou apresentar em português, a palestra dela vai ser em inglês. Vocês podem fazer perguntas em português se vocês quiserem, a gente traduz. Mas treinem em inglês de vocês, façam a pergunta em inglês. A Frances é bastante paciente, está acostumada já com a gente. A Frances, ela é bióloga, ela fez graduação e mestrado na Universidade de Pretória, na África do Sul, e o doutorado dela na Northwestern University, que é onde ela está atualmente. Ela é uma das maiores especialistas em forks. Vocês são forks? São forks. Forks são todas as plantas pequenas, herbáceas, não graminoides, ou seja, nada que é árvore, arbusto, graminha. Mais ou menos entra no papo de forks, o que a gente nunca prestou muita atenção, e hoje em dia a gente tem visto que, principalmente nos ecossistemas africanos, nos nossos é extremamente importantes, então a Frances já fala um pouquinho disso para vocês. Ela tem uma grande experiência em ecologia de campos e savanas tropicais e subtropicais da África. Então, tudo que vocês quiserem saber sobre esse assunto, aproveitem, e depois da palestra dela, a gente vai lá na Botânica, na sala de reuniões, e quem quiser trocar ideia com ela, a gente vai conversar um pouquinho como é fazer pesquisa na África. Se vocês quiserem marcar um dia para vir conversar com ela, aproveitem, porque ela está aqui só essa semana. So I will give you yet time so you can talk a little bit and show the amazing pictures about the grasslands and savannas in Africa. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for the introduction, Alexandra. Is it working?
I call it here.
So can you hear? I can try to, can you hear me then? Right? Okay, it's, bom dia. Thank you for hosting me. Obrigado. It's really such a privilege for me to be here in your most amazing country. I have been here in 2001, and it was singing away my age, but as a master's student, and I was attending the IADS with my supervisor, who is also working on grasslands, and he said to me, "You must see the Brazilian grasslands." So we went to the campus, and it was just, I fell in love with Brazil, and it was too long since I've come back, so it is so nice. And thank you for hosting me, Alessandra. It's just amazing to be here. And yes, today I want to tell you a little bit more about all the things in Africa. Everyone gets stuck with trees and grasses and beautiful animals. So don't get me wrong, I'm also very passionate about our savanna trees and grassy plains, and also the amazing large animals we have in Africa. But I will tell you a little bit more about another component which I feel very interested in. Just to give you some background on South African savannas overall. So this is a vegetation map of South Africa, and there's Cape Town here with the Floristic Kingdom. So that's why I love to visit Cape Town for a holiday, because there's no expectation for me of knowing any of the rocks, because it's a completely different Floristic Kingdom. But this is the area, the green and the brownish area. These are our grasslands. This is the tropical grassy biomes, which in South Africa we have divided into two grasslands. Treeless savanna or treeless grassland, and then the savanna that spans from the most arid areas in the western side, also dominated by seafood grasses, less dominance and less cover, but also some shrubs and trees. And then as we move along the environmental gradients or the rainfall gradient, it becomes more mesic, and this is in the area where I live, Johannesburg, which is all up on the ecotone between the highland grasslands and also the tree savanna. In the northern parts of Pretoria, we have something that after now visiting the scenario this week, I have in my mind seen some overlap in at least the vegetation, but very little characteristically. But of course, at least the vegetation structure on these low nutrient savannas of our water-bird system. Then in the northern parts, it's what we call the springbok flats, dominated by acacias, Achilles, of course, and Senegalias. And then in the northern parts, we have also a semi-arid and arid system of savanna, and it's not very clear here, but then you can see all the boabats there in the valley. And then just to show you all the different types of savannas that we also host in South Africa. This is Mopani savanna, dominated actually throughout a lot, the central parts of Southern Africa. It's a dominant of one species, which is Mopani on this basis. And we really haven't figured out yet why it is dominating and yes, so this is taken in the National Park. Heterogeneous structure, trees, shrubs, and a continuous herbaceous layer of grassland support. And this is where I have conducted many of my experimental studies was done in the Kruger National Park. Then some allo-dominated, more music savannas that we get more to the eastern parts. And then, of course, the two music savannas closer to the eastern coast with the annual precipitation between 900 and 1,200. So in our terms, this is music, of course, and on the average side, this is far less than 300 millimeters of rain. Right, so in the savanna ecology, we have learned quite a great deal about the coexistence of these two layers of vegetation, the tree layer and then the seed-bearing bark layer, and also how they interact, but also how they co-dominate, and also the alternate states where sometimes trees dominate and in other areas which is very often also a Jaffic related type of grassland dominated in the savanna area. So we have this grassland scientist and the savanna scientist have spent many years going into the tree grass coexistence conundrum to better understand it. So I promise you pictures of our iconic herbivores, here they are. So of course, our tree grass coexistence are very dependent on these ecosystem modifiers, engineers that open up the system, that keep the system from encroachment. And of course, our larger ones, the elephants, are very, very important in keeping the tree layer open to give access for light to reach the herbaceous layer. And but also, of course, not only to open up and to destroy trees, but also for seed dispersal of some of our iconic tree species like marula. I'm sure all of you have liked the marula tree. That's thanks to our elephants. So then the mixed trees, some of our antelope, they are also important in regulating the dominance shift between trees and grasses because they feed on the seedlings of the tree. So if these numbers are being maintained in a suitable manner, then of course the tree grass existence is. I don't really want to use the word balance, but yes. So I hope you follow what I'm saying. Giraffes, of course, they are also very iconic, and especially for my friend Professor Fidelis, who is very fond of giraffe when she visits me, and they are also responsible designing the architecture of the trees and opening up the systems. And then the grazers, of which we have many different species, the zebra and then the African buffalo. And so in rangeland ecology or in savanna ecology, it's all the textbook would say these are the grazers, they feed on grasses, and these are the browsers, they feed on the leaves of trees and plants, and big feeders can shift between these two. Right, so I would as a reminder, I will come back to that later because, of course, we realized later on that grazers don't eat grass. Another very important regulator in this system are porcupines, the diggers, and I have learned from your lab that you are also porcupines, you like digging, and that's perfect because that's also important ecosystem modifiers in our system. And then, of course, fire. Fire also very, very important environmental driver to maintain the tree grass coexistence in African savannas. And fire is something that humans recently really tried to keep out of the systems because they fear fire for obvious reasons. And the longer they try to suppress fire in our systems, the more dangerous it becomes when there are some wildfires. So we still have to have some way to go in terms of also legislation and management of what's the best practices to keep humans safe, but also to maintain and to protect the diversity of our savannas and grasslands. Another very important driver that I think maybe less important in the solar system, I might be wrong, but is seasonality. So we have an extremely strong, dry, very dry season, which could also include some frost events, and that also regulates the vegetation and the persistence of the species that we find, particularly in the herbaceous layer, are also adapted and dependent on frost, and also in terms of the herbaceous layer. Our grassy layer, grasses and forbs, need to be adapted to being defoliated not only by fire and herbivores, but also to protect their resources below ground because of the frost incidents. Right, so with all of this, we have tried to understand tree grass coexistence in African savannas. However, there are also another growth form that dominate in these systems from time to time, and these are the forbs. So forbs are the ones that, well, in the African context for many years, everything that's not a drainage grass was just lumped into a forb basket, right? So that's what my interest is, because over many years I have felt that these forbs play a very important role also in this dynamics between trees and grasses and other things, and that they serve a very important functional role, but also in terms of ecosystem services that they provide for the human livelihoods in Africa. So this brings me to what I will briefly discuss with you today is this layer, this other group, this other growth form, which we have neglected in savanna ecology, at least in Africa, for many years. So it is largely based on this very recent paper on the present and the past and the future of the forbs of tropical and subtropical grasslands, of which Professor Fidelis is also one of the senior authors. So it was a great team of people working together to figure out, what are the real functions, what do we know, and where are the gaps. So I will just briefly go through some of the highlights of our findings of this synthesis. But to start with, just to highlight what's in general, why have they been neglected? And there are several reasons, but I will just stick to one. I think highlight some significant functions and services, and then how do we perceive the future of these important for communities. Right, so first of all, I think the most challenging question is, what is the form? So, and that is after I've worked with people from several vegetation scientific communities, we realize that the way in which we see forms are sometimes completely different. And how can we understand the ecology and the importance of a growth form that we don't agree on what it really entails? So what we have discovered is that almost 90% of the savanna literature, they just, in the text somewhere, they have all these beautiful tables of, all the different plant families, and this is how it responds to fire or to herbivore or to climate change and blah blah. And then you will have one line saying forms. And forms were not identified, they were not recognized in the hundreds of different phylogenies that they represent and the plant families, of course, that they represent. So how can we really understand savanna dynamics if we don't really truly understand the meaning of what all of this? So for this presentation, we will briefly just say that forms are non-graminoid flowering plants that grows in the herbaceous layer. It may be completely herbaceous above and below ground, or it may have limited above ground liquefied tissues, and but the below ground tissue can range from herbaceous to woody. Right? So this is very superficial, and this is also the other reason why I'm here is because the team of us who started these discussions, and Professor Fidelis and Dr. Bamba, we will sit together again and to work on a decision to how we can address this issue for future global analysis. Right, so how could we have neglected these beautiful flowers? It's because they don't dominate, they flower for a short period of time, sometimes they only flower after the fire event, or even only during a drought. But these are just like this very small bit, and this is all taken from one area of our grasslands in South Africa, and yet they contribute to over 70% of the total species research in our savannas. These are dominant families in savannas, in other words, with a tree and a grass component, Canthaceae, Amaranthaceae, and Fabaceae. And then if we move to the higher altitude open grasslands with no trees, there's also a shift in the dominance of grass families as Asteraceae becomes much more abundant and dominant, which I've learned now is also different than Cerrado, because Asteraceae seems to be one of the dominant plant families in the port layer. And with South Africa's savannas, the Asteraceae is really not very prominent in the savannas. However, it's very prominent in the grasslands. Right, so similarly, like looking at the drivers of tree-grass coexistence, all those same drivers also have a very important role to play in the functional and especially the taxonomical diversity of the forests in grasslands and savannas. But not only above ground, but of course also below ground. And we as South Africans have learned a great deal from Brazilian literature and collaborators about the below ground diversity, functional diversity that our grasslands and savannas also contain. So the orange parts are the drivers, so herbivore and fire and seasonality. And these are the ones, herbivore and fire regulates the above ground, can also be important for below ground, of course. But then we have also fossorial type of animals that dig and make holes, and also rodents that are responsible for seed dispersal of the soil layer, etc. And then seasonality as well. Right, so we will just look a little bit into this. It's just a summary of all the potential functions that forks can provide to grassy ecosystems. If we start with forks and large mammals, and this brings me back to the slide with the iconic large herbivores. Grazers eat grasses and browsers eat leaves of trees and shrubs. And it was recently by some American lab and scientists, and also some work that was done by ourselves, that it was indicated that now with the growing interest in environmental DNA and metabolic coding, that there are also, the grazers also feed on grass material, on C3 forks. And that's something that we really need to look into. What are the real forage potential of forks in these lands? Clearly, they cannot provide equal biomass of forage than grasses and trees, but of course they have other functions. So what we have done here in terms of diversity, and I think this is very commonly known, that when a system like African savannas have evolved with large herbivores, if you exclude large herbivores from the system, of course, you can expect that there will be a significant decrease in the fork diversity in these areas. Right, so we need large herbivores to open up the system to maintain fork diversity. What we've seen in terms of food items, and this is where, after synthesizing the literature and also getting experts, we've also learned that forks have a higher digestibility and food protein and all other macroelements than grasses and some shrubs, but it's also at certain times of the year. So the African herbivores are dependent on these high nutritious forage resources at certain times of the year. And if you talk to mammal ecologists, it's very nicely also correlated with when the large herbivores are either lactating or they are pregnant, so they don't need as much biomass intake, but it needs to be digestible and very nutritious for them to be able to lactate, and also to self-medicate. So just as we have learned from ethnomedicine, herbivores are super smart. They select certain fork species from the grassland ecosystem when they have a particular ailment. So they don't need to take it in large quantities. It's like us, when we are having an ailment, we're not supposed to take the entire the box of tablets. We are selective and take it regularly. So for that reason, it has been neglected because grasses plants overall has only been seen as important for forage to maintain productivity of large animals. However, there has been some wonderful research that was done on how herbivores select for these medicinal plants. Even some of them that were perceived as toxic, they select for these toxic plants, but they don't overdose with those toxic plants. They just need a little bit, especially if they are infected by black parasites. So, in parallel to this, we have also sampled some dung, some fecal samples from elephants and impalas, and also from cattle, to see if we can detect what's the intake of forbs in the diets of southern large animals. And we were really surprised at the dark blue here. It's just an indication of the consumption of food, forbs as food items in large animals, including livestock. So for livestock, in particular in Africa, they are very important. But unfortunately, landowners see forbs, when they see forbs among their grasses, they perceive it as negative because some of them are toxic, and they want to manage against the dominance of forbs. Then, of course, forbs are very important for invertebrates, pollinators, and for invertebrate diversity. So we have all been aware of the scare of the drop in invertebrates and insect diversity. And of course, this is also strongly related to the management practices in other parts of tropical and subtropical savannas and grasslands, where it has been the management practices are against fire and are against forb dominance. However, there are these beauties that get lost, and of course they are very important pollinator resources, also for food security, because pollinators are very important also for some of the economic crop production. Then, in terms of the botanical use, South Africa in particular has a very, very rich ethno-medicine plant flora that 27 million people still depend on traditional medicine, of which most of these come from forbs and not trees and grasses. They do use trees and grasses for other purposes, of course, but then over 1,000 indigenous species of forbs are being used medicinally. Then the consumption of indigenous forbs as leafy vegetables are also extremely important, and I think this is a threat in future climate change projections also, because some of these very important forb species are also now becoming under threat because of changing fire systems, fire regimes, and also droughts, etc. Forbs and fire, these are some of our flowers that withstand fire and also flower, but not directly after fire always, but they are definitely dependent on fire before they flower. And sometimes it can even take months before these forbs flower, but it is in the dry season, there's the landscape will burn, and then it will be extremely hot for a period until more or less this time of the year, and only then after the first rains, because there is a combination of dormancy breaking, of heat, as well as ash water, some of the hypotheses that we have recently formulated to make them flower or to make them germinate. So this is one of my students, master students, Yani. She is finishing her master, and she has done some sort of seed bank studies. We collected seed from soil from the experimental burning plots in Kruger. Now these experimental burning plots are running since the 1950s, so it's really an extensive fire experiment where we tested the effects of fire frequency on the soil seed bank, and whether frequent fire or the fire exclusion have depleted the soil seed bank. And so far we didn't find a very clear effect of fire frequency on the germination of forbs in these systems. However, these systems still remain grass-dominated, and the higher the fire frequency, the higher the ratio between grasses and forbs. And this was somewhat other than what I expected for a dry system. And then, of course, in the area that has not burned for quite some time, it's closer to what we would call a grass forb balance. In terms of the seed, so Yanni collected seeds from the surrounding vegetation and they put it to germination. And what we have, of course, we always compare that with grasses. And it turned out that the forb species have higher viability than grass species. So these are the amount of seeds that we tested. So most of the forb species have shown at least viability for in this particular ecosystem. So for forbs did not do as well as grasses after standard germination. However, the grasses did best under heat shock, which is also similar to what you have reported here in your systems. However, we still need to do some real experimental work on what conditions can we use to break dormancy of the forb species, because that seed bank seems to be very persistent. Seeds are still viable, but it's really difficult to get the signals right for germination. And then, of course, the below-ground blood bones. These are also very typical structures, although it might not be as huge and impressive as in the Cerrado, but we were very lucky to have your colleagues in South Africa to teach us more about this below ground and the importance of the below ground structures and also the blood bank. So Aline Bombo, she was the one who presented this workshop in South Africa to teach the people from South Africa the importance and how to start getting our hands dirty and start digging like porcupines. So this was the first study that we have completed jointly, and that is where we also went to some sites with fire exclusion as well as herbivore exclusion and the effects of these very important environmental drivers, and when they are taken out, what happens below ground. And we have seen very similar patterns in a recent study also by my PhD student, Sylvester Leva, and he is the one also working in the Kruger National Park on these large burn strings of the experimental burn plots, where it's the green represent the grass and the blue the forbs, and clearly they respond differently. So when people do analyses in African system of the herbaceous layer and they don't separate the forbs and the grasses, they get a little bit of a skewed impression of the real dynamics, because it's very clear that the forbs respond differently. Again, under annual burn, frequent burn, there was an increase in the density of the buds, but where the herbivores were present. So what we suggest is that although fire is a very important driver in the system, and because it's a semi-arid system, we cannot ignore the very important effect of our large herbivores in maintaining the below ground blood bank, as can also be seen here in the annual fire treatment in the presence of herbivores, which also has a much more balanced dominance of the below ground organ types. So this was just to confirm that it was also related to what we have seen in the other study. And now, lastly, the forbs and the importance of carbon sinks. So in South Africa, I think we got lost a little bit in the story. Our trees do this, grasses do that, and that is how we understand this coexistence of surveillance in our system. And that there's so much that we can learn from trees, which is absolutely true. However, I would like to know that, there's also inner life of forms, and of which the authors are the tropical grassy biomes, because there's so many information captured in the ground, not only in trees but also in our forests. So that also stimulated some more digging of plants, and so this is a little bit more bigger. And so what my students, I have some students working on the potential of the below ground organ types across the rainfall gradient to capture the below ground carbon and also the root shoot ratio. So this is just based on, of course, the very generally applied 0.45 index of below ground biomass to estimate carbon, and the blue is above ground and the reddish brown is below ground carbon values, and in the wetter regions it's almost 2.5-fold more than above ground, and even more in the semi-arid savannas, and then in the very arid systems there seem to be a swap. So that is what we want to look into, and we suspected that it could be water as a more important driver of capturing water in the drier systems rather than carbon, but that's still a hypothesis that we need to test for. Then, of course, clonality, also very important. Functional adaptation of forms in both grasslands and savannas. There are some more pictures. This is typically what we found in the more arid systems. That most of they don't have as much carbon storage, underground storage organs. However, they have very long taproot systems that are seeking the water table. So, in terms of the percentage water loss, we have this still needs to be statistically tested for, but of course there are also some indications that the above ground would lose more water after drying opposed to the below ground because of the potential carbon that they store below ground. And this figure here comes from a student, Elaine Sturton, who's now doing a PhD on also testing all of these indices and the type of soil organic carbon measures that the people use for carbon credits, and that we want to really test it for tropical and subtropical grasslands to see if it's really applicable, because it's an index used globally, but does it really work for these systems in Africa? So in terms of root shoot ratio, this is the red line is the global ratio. The blue line is the average for South Africa. It's about 14.77, so which means that for 1 gram of above ground, it's about 14.7 below ground. And and what I want to highlight here is in this system here, the Ormesic grassland savanna system, where it is way above 20 when it is a pristine grassland or a grassland that has not been transformed. Well, the moment that it is transformed, it falls below that blue line, but even after transformation, it is still above the global value. Right, to conclude, what are the future of our communities? They are threatened as most of the other terrestrial ecosystems, but particularly tropical and subtropical grasslands. because of agricultural expansion and afforestation, and some of our community ecology data also shows that almost all, about 100% of the underground storage organs have been lost after ploughing, and over 60%, over 50% after afforestation. So this is what we are aiming for. There's a very recent paper by Nelakar, and also to follow in his tracks that restoration of tropical and subtropical grasses should be more fork-centric. How we are going to do it, that is still, we need to figure it out, because it's not a case of we can just sow in species and they are all ruderal and they will just come up. It doesn't work like that because of this very important below ground component that makes it really difficult to restore properly. We need to produce more data in terms of the seeds and the seed ecology, understanding the germination and the dormancy cues, and how to implement that to optimize restoration in these ecosystems. And these are my students working also on the germinability. And again, students from your lab place, from Alessandro's lab, has been extremely helpful also to help our students how to design these experiments for seed generation. However, good news is that at least we know that at least 60% of the dominant fork species in our systems are viable. So they still produce viable seed. So we need to do something with that. So those are the next steps, and we are slowly but surely getting there. So just to conclude, as for any system, we can't conserve anything if we don't know. So to conserve and manage the fork communities, we need to understand the ecology better. And we need to focus more on regeneration strategies, seed banks, bed banks, persistence, tonality, the fork grass coexistence, and how it relates to changes in nutrients, changes in climate, etc. And grazing and fire management to favor fork diversity and not to prevent fork dominance in certain systems. To look at some keystone species. So which species could we potentially, what's the English word, how to promote them as species that needs to be included in restoration practices. And so far we think that these below ground species that are really, they are very important in terms of food items for human livelihoods. They are medicinal plants, but also they are important carbon plants. So if we can design things around that and get it to communicate and educate people and to get it into legislation, wow, that would be fantastic. So that it is maybe very ambitious, but of course, what is science without being ambitious? Right. So thank you so much for listening and for your time. It has really been a pleasure for me. Thank you.